right, so this lecture is going to look at the Harriet Jacobs reading I assigned. And so I want to first give you a little bit of context as to why I assigned this reading. So this week, again, it's such a quick kind of overview, but I wanted to connect some of the early history of U.S. slavery to the conversations around Blackness in space we'll be having when we look at geographic segregation. Because the kind of way that Blackness is policed and tied to certain spaces and seen in different spaces really has to be contextualized or understood within this history. So I wanted to start here. So I've given you that video where I talked a little bit about the context of U.S. slavery, kind of the uniqueness of being a place that didn't import the most number of enslaved Africans, but that through kind of laws that made it so that anyone born from an enslaved woman would then become a slave, through the way that white slave owners used sexual assault to increase their number of slaves, through the ways that families were separated, through natal alienation and other efforts to kind of sell off and break up families. It really made the plantation into a space, at least a space that was designed to reinforce the perception of Black people as chattel, as property, and not as human beings with social relations. One of the reasons that I assign this particular text, and I'll get into Jacobs a little bit and the uniqueness as a slave narrative, but in general, I want to start with a slave narrative because it really speaks to the way that people who were enslaved both understood the ways in which they were being seen and defined within the space of the plantation in the South and even in the North, as well as the ways in which they resisted that, right? And I think Jacobs does that particularly well. So that's going to be the big focus of what I want you to kind of take away from this. I just want to briefly talk to you about slave narratives themselves. So, this is a huge genre, and I'm hoping you've taken a African American literature course, or you've read these in high school and maybe encountered some of these. It's a really fundamental and important genre for understanding African American literature, African American resistance and politics in the U.S. It's interesting because initially these were published abroad in England, right? Partially because that's a lot of people fled there, but also because that was the only place where they could get these things published. So first it was enslaved Africans in England that did this. Later in the US, some of them went and published and toured in the UK, and then others eventually became a genre within the US itself, right, in the 19th century. There's a couple of prominent ones I've put on here, images. Let me see if I can click these actually for you. Many of you have probably read, sorry this image is a bit fuzzy, Frederick Douglass's narrative. That's a pretty famous one. A lot of times in high school you look at it. If you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend Henry Bibb's narrative. Again, these images are all pretty rough because they're old. But his is another interesting one that looks at family as a kind of resisting force and drive. And then, of course, we'll talk about Harriet Jacobs today. This was one of the earliest genres of African American literature. By no means was it the only one. If you're familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, where there was a number of other kind of enslaved Africans that used poetry to write literature. But again, it became one of the prominent ways that enslaved people could speak about their experiences themselves, right? But like anything, they had to be very careful of how they talked about things because of their audience. So these works were often in competition directly with fictional accounts written by white abolitionists, again with the same goal of abolishing slavery, but it's very different when someone like Harriet Beecher Stowe writes about slavery as a white woman, as opposed to Harriet Jacobs, who's writing it from the perspective of someone who's lived it. So they were competing because, again, like anything, even today, people choose which books they're going to pick up and read, right? What they're interested in hearing, what version of the story they want to get. So they had to, again, be very careful about how they constructed their stories. And if you had read the entire narrative, that's something it'd be very clear in Jacob's text. So let me just tell you a little bit about her. So Harriet Jacobs was an author, activist, abolitionist. She was a fugitive, but she managed to escape and get her freedom. She was born in 1813, and she, was enslaved. She narrates obviously plenty of that in this, but she eventually was able to flee north. But before she did that, her story stands out because she, again, was trying to escape Mr. Flint, she calls him in the book, the white slave owner who sexually harassed her for years, and she was so desperate, and you don't get this in the portions I assign, that first she has a relationship with with a white man, um, and just figures, if I do this, if I sleep with him, if I have some kids, maybe Mr. Flint will be tired and leave me alone. So she has these children. That doesn't discourage him, but makes him angrier. So eventually she just tries to flee, but she's not able to run north because he's scouring her. As we talked about in the context video, the early kind of policing forces in the South were slave catchers, right? So she wasn't able to flee because he had hired people to keep a watch out for her. So what she does is she spends 7 years hiding in what she calls her loophole of retreat, and it's this tiny, if you've ever seen a shed, not in a house attic, but like a small shed in someone's backyard, there's that top kind of rectangular space. She hid in one of those for 7 years, and she had kind of a peephole where she could see her grandmother and kids, but she talks about it as a space where she couldn't fully lay down, couldn't fully sit up. And when she left, she had physical impairments and other things from being in that space. But that's how desperate she was for freedom, that kind of confining space that caused her physical damage was seen as a freer space to her than living on the plantation. So it's interesting to think about, again, the way she defined freedom and space and what was worth more than the other. So she does that for 7 years. She's eventually able to flee, and you read the part where she gets north and works as as a nanny, or what she calls a nurse. And then she publishes this narrative in 1861. This is one of the very few narratives that we have written from a woman who was enslaved, and it's one of the first to talk about sexual abuse. And so that's part of the thing that makes her work unique. And also because she's really speaking to white northern women, right? So a lot of it plays on their sentimental views of virtue, and she really tries to cast herself as someone who, not in like a fake way, but really emphasizes this idea of she, just like them, is a woman who wants to live a good and virtuous life, but the conditions of slavery make it very different for her. So it's a unique story in a lot of ways, and if you're interested in this history, I'd encourage you to go check it out. It's free online because of how old it is, so I'd encourage you to check it out. So I just want to talk, I assigned you just a few chapters from this, and they're very short, but I want to talk about a couple of them because I think it really gets in this idea of space and the early ways that Blackness was defined. So chapter 14, The Jealous Mistress, is probably one of the most well-known chapters. There's another one kind of related to this, but the narrative of the Jealous Mistress is kind of what Jacob's story is famous for, right? I've shown you in these, there's two pictures, one photo and another artistic depiction of what some of these slave quarters look like. Jacobs narrates her own story is unique. This speaks to the chapter itself. Like many, if not most of the people publishing slave narratives, she is what we would today call mixed race, right? And this is why, if you notice in that video last week, I talked about how that's a pretty modern image and the idea of being mixed versus just being black. Most people who were enslaved were, mixed, right? I got done telling you in the other video that the way that slave owners propagated their so-called property was through rape and sexual abuse. So often with Frederick Douglass, his narrative, he talks about the fact that his slave owner was his father, right? This is so common. And so there's a lot of mixing, and then and primarily through this avenue of trying to increase your property, so these slave owners would have their very own offspring, their very own children as their slaves, right? And this is something Jacobs talks a lot about. She actually thinks, she doesn't know, again, because familial relations were hard to keep track of because of the way people were separated and because of the violence and death. So she doesn't know, but she speculates that her dad was actually a free white man because of someone with the same last name, right? But because of kind of her station and her lineage, as well as her grandmother, who becomes really well known for some of the preserves and crackers she makes and sells to other white people in the area, her grandmother is able to secure for herself her very own kind of, she calls it house or home, or one of these slave quarters. And sorry, this image is very blurry. But the idea is you get a sense that most of the time, and if you read Frederick Douglass's narrative, in these kind of, the slave quarters were like barracks where you had people sleeping in them on mats, possibly if they had something more than that, but people were crowded in. Douglass gives a very different picture, right? Jacobs really speaks to kind of the different ways that certain groups had a bit more, if you can call it privilege within the context of being enslaved, right? So her grandmother was able to have her own space, right? And that helps her out in many ways, as we'll get to. But this is the context for the jealousy with the mistress. And this happens a lot, particularly with women like Jacobs, who she was seen as more desirable because she was mixed race, because of colorism and her light skin and her hair. And so Mr. Flint is harassing her, right? This is sexual abuse and harassment, but that's not how it's viewed by the mistress, right? It's interesting the way that she makes it clear that that's what it is. So there's a quote where she says, "I would rather drudge out my life on a cotton plantation till the grave opened to give me rest than to live with an unprincipled master and a jealous mistress." This upends our views of slavery. Often we kind of talk about the way that it would be much better to be a house slave, than a field slave, and the lighter skin you are, the better off you were. And to a degree, that is certainly true in terms of some of the physical violence that we know about slavery. But Jacob's narrative talks about a different kind of terror, right? So yes, she is instead of being out in the space of the field on the plantation, her story gives us a very different image of the household or the domestic space of the plantation. So she narrates in this chapter kind of the everyday terror of trying to, one, avoid this sexual abuse, and on the other hand, avoid this jealous mistress, right, the wife, who sees her as a competitor rather than, someone suffering at the hands of her husband. So it's interesting the way that she gives us a very different image of the plantation and deconstructs the idea that, being an enslaved person working in the house is somehow better. The other thing on the flip side of this that I wanted to kind of bring to your attention about space is the way that Mr. Flint uses his control over that domestic space to harass her, right? So throughout this chapter, she talks about the different kind of efforts she makes to try to run away from him. She pretends she doesn't understand what he's talking about. She's just barely 15 or 16. She, is like, "I'm too innocent. I don't understand what you're asking for." She tries to find different ways to avoid the situation, right? But because ultimately Mr. Flint is the slave owner, he owns a plantation, he owns the home, he uses his power over the space to try to, kind of solidify his control over Linda. On a side note, I forgot to mention this earlier. Jacobs used the pseudonym Linda within the story, and she also gives other pseudonyms. She changes the names of both herself and other characters just for kind of protection. So she talks about Linda in the story, but that's her. So one of the examples of how Mr. Flint uses space is when he orders her to come place meals in his room or to fan away the flies, right? So he uses his control to say, "I'm going to put you in the same space as I am so I can, exert my power over you." He even, at a certain point in this chapter, takes his 4-year-old to sleep in his quarters and says, "Well, because of that, now I need to have Linda come and sleep here too," right? And she talks about the terror of that, of trying to get away from it. And so it's interesting to think of the different ways that he uses his power over the space to continue to try to harass and to trap her. But on the contrast, Jacobs uses her own power, the little bit of power she has to resist this, right? So the only thing that keeps Mr. Flint at bay is well, one, the jealousy of the mistress, right? So Mrs. Flint herself also pulls the same kind of schemes, and she says, no, I'm going to have her sleep in my room. And then she stands over her at night, right? She tells us how she would wake up in the middle of the night and, the mistress would be standing over her, right? Which would be startling to anyone. But also, Mr. Flint has to keep up appearances, right? It's not that he's afraid of her grandmother, but again, her grandmother, as I mentioned, had carved out some sense of respect in the community, right? It's not that she wasn't still enslaved, right? Or didn't still kind of suffer under white supremacy, but it's much more complex than that. So because she sold preserves and crackers, because she was able to talk and kind of mediate between some of the enslaved folks, because of all of this, and the fact that she knew a lot of the other white plantation owners and community members who were respectable, he had to keep up the appearance, right? It's not that he wanted to be known as someone who was sleeping around with his slaves. So he had to keep up appearances. So she was able to use that and her grandmother's kind of reputation as a refuge for her. And the fact that her grandmother had this space, her own quarters, also was a refuge for her. And I pulled this quote where she said, how often did I rejoice that I lived in a town where all the inhabitants knew each other. If I had been on a remote plantation or lost among the multitude of a crowded city, I should not be a living woman at this day. So this, I think, more than anything, highlights the unique role that space plays in protecting Jacobs, right? She talks about if they were, further out where, Mr. Flint didn't really have to worry about what other people in the community thought, or if they were in a big city, again, where neighbors didn't really know each other, he would have been able to exercise the full power of his desire to abuse her. But because of the unique nature of their community, she was able to hide at her grandmother's house, find different ways to avoid him under the threat that if her grandmother found out, the neighborhood would find out, right? So again, she's able to use the unique dynamics of their space, just like Mr. Flint tried to use space to control her and abuse her. She uses the unique dynamics of their space to protect herself. I will say on a side note from this story, the jealous mistress string gets even more fascinating, sad but fascinating, because there's a point in the book where she forces Linda, right, the character Linda, who's really Jacobs, to cut her hair off in an effort to get her to be less attractive to the husband. Again, it's a very interesting dynamic, and Jacobs is very critical of the way that white women were compliant, or they helped the power of slavery rather than fighting it. They were both victims of Mr. Flint in very different ways, but they were both victims of him. But instead of being angry at Mr. Flint, she often talks about the way that that was taken out on her. So the next thing I want to look at, I'm going to put these two chapters together, chapter 8 and chapter 12 that I assigned you. And these are looking at two different ways that space are seen. So I wanted to circle back to this question of the North and kind of the myth of the North as being this safe space of freedom. And we'll talk about that in the final chapter as well. But I also want to talk about how a fear of insurrection shaped the plantations themselves and the towns. So in chapter 8, Jacob spends quite a bit of time talking about how enslaved people are taught to think about the North, right? And so on one hand, she goes through and says, yes, of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know that, slave owners, tell their enslaved people that the North is just a place where, Black people are in squalor and they're suffering, and here on the plantation you are provided for and you have food and shelter. And so they really try to make it seem like they're better off in the kind of quote unquote benevolent environment of the plantation, right? That was a big part of the narrative used to justify slavery, was this idea of like, well, really, it's a benevolent space. They're better off here because at least they are provided for. So there's one that kind of attempt to indoctrinate the enslaved people to say that's what the North is like. But Jacobs points to the fact that they know better than that, right? That there's enough stories about people who went north and found freedom. They know better than that. But the real reality, the real thing that challenges the perception of the North as a land of freedom or a space of freedom is the ways in which slave catchers and other kind of policing forces, and then later the Fugitive Slave Act itself, have instituted kind of these systematic ways of ushering Black people back into slavery, right? So I put this as kind of a well-known image warning Black people, or people of color as they were called then, or colored people, um, to look out for police officers, watchmen, right? Because back then police was a little less informal. You had for hire groups, you had slave catchers, you had a few different groups going on. But they told them to avoid talking to them, right? To watch out for them because they've been ordered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. I put this up here, one, because it highlights Jacob's critique, and I pulled out this quote where she says, "But will the free state sustain a law which hurls fugitives back into slavery? How can the slaves resolve to become men?" So in other words, how can you really call yourself a free land? How can the North see itself as a civilized space that's better than the South when it's really participating in slavery by saying, you can get here, but we're going to push you back into subjugation? So in her mind, what's the difference, between living on the plantation and living with the constant fear of being sent back? So she's kind of pointing out that the spaces are, different, but still exercising this fear and power over Black people, whether in the North or the South. But I also wanted to show you this image because a lot of you mentioned kind of the ways you see connections between this past and what we see even today with some of the relationship between Black communities and the police, right? This fear of what's going to happen if I call the police, what's the perception of, where other, especially white Americans, think of the police as someone you call when you're in danger, you need help. It's a very different relationship for a lot of Black people when you're fearful that that's actually going to be the end of your life or the people's lives around you. We know Jacob Blake is a prime example of that, trying to break up a fight. And he ended up being shot 7 times in the back, right? So it's interesting to think how way back under slavery, you have this same kind of understanding and fear of policing powers and the different ways that they are related to Black people. So the other chapter I wanted you to look at is on the actual plantations, how the same policing power translated and how it was related to fears of insurrections. So I mentioned in, or if you haven't watched the other video, maybe you still will see it. I talked about this week the Haitian Revolution in particular, but which, if you're not familiar, culminated in the very early 1800s. The only Black-led independence movement that caused massive sparks of fear throughout the Western Hemisphere. But there are also all these kind of smaller rebellions where you have enslaved people and also free Black people, and also you had a lot of interracial coalitions too, working together to rise up. Much like the U.S. or the American Revolution, it was a violent uprising where people were fighting for their freedom. The same thing happened with these, rebellions. So the fear of this led to these kind of patrols, or these, these days where you would have white patrols brought in to kind of police the plantation. And really what it was about exercising power over the Black people in those spaces to kind of remind them of where they were in the hierarchy. So this chapter is interesting because Jacobs talks a lot about these non-slave owning whites who were often poor, but these roles of policing and searching, the slave quarters, and they would, beat enslaved people, whip them, drag them through the street, harass them, take some of their stuff. But it was a way for them to exercise power, right? So they weren't the wealthy landowning or slave owning white Americans, but the fact that they were called in these moments to kind of squash any sense of rebellion or exercise their authority was a way of reasserting white supremacy. And it also made them feel that they had some semblance of power, even though they didn't have the same wealth as the white Americans who owned slaves and plantations. So it's interesting to think how policing power, even then under slavery, was a way of asserting kind of the definitions of how you're meant to exist within a space, right? So the last chapter I want to talk about is the quote unquote freedom in the North chapter, right? So I told you Jacob's story. It's a long journey that she has of trying to escape, Mr. Flint, finding different ways where she's like, well, maybe if I have kids, he'll leave me alone, or this or that. She hides in this little kind of shed attic for 7 years, and eventually is able to make her way north. And you all probably heard, kind of the narrative that if you get north of the Mason-Dixon line, people think they're free, right? But as we've talked a lot with the Fugitive Slave Act and other things, we know that's not necessarily the case. And so this chapter, she really further deconstructs that notion. She talks about how, the many ways that she was, asked to sit in different places or, not be in the same space as even other people of color, right? Or people who were, white immigrants and other workers of her same class. And so even in the North, she talks about the fact that white supremacy exists, it just operates in a different way. So it's interesting to think or challenge this notion of like the South is this space of complete, repression and oppression and slavery, and the North is the land of the free. Well, Jacobs tells us that's not the case, right? I pulled out this quote where she says, everywhere I found the same manifestations of that cruel prejudice, right? The same manifestations she saw in the South, which so discourages the feelings and represses the energies of the colored people. I think the thing that stands out for me in this chapter is when she mentions being at the hotel and sitting with all the other domestic workers who are of different ethnicities and races, but she's the only black one, right? And again, remember, she is, in terms of the kind of cast of colorism, she's very light skinned, but it doesn't matter because she has African ancestry, which makes her black, right? So they see her, and it doesn't matter, that she's a domestic worker like everybody else. She alone is asked to eat in the kitchen while all the other domestic workers can eat there with the kids that they're taking care of. And so she finds that even amongst the people of her same class group, right? They're not, upper class, they're separated from the other folks. But even amongst the people in her same class group, her race puts her at the bottom of that hierarchy and still separates her. So I think that Jacob's story shows us is a good kind of foreshadowing what happens after emancipation even, and is a good connection to the junior provost story that you listened to in the podcast, that even when you get to kind of spaces or times that are supposed to give freedom, that blackness still becomes this way of defining and saying, you don't belong in the same space, or you don't have the same sense of freedom in the space as others, right? So she gets to the North, but she doesn't have the same freedom as the North as others. Or with Junior Provost, he gets to the farmland, but he doesn't have the same ability to have freedom in the farm as others, right? So it's interesting to think of the way that blackness itself tends to separate people from full freedom in whichever land that they're inhabiting, whatever space they're in, whether it's the North or the South, whether it's the farm or the city, as we're going to continue to see as we look specifically at geographic segregation next week. Blackness becomes the fact or the thing that defines the way that people are allowed to exist within a space. So hopefully between, the context lecture, a little bit on U.S. slavery, the podcast episodes, and then these readings from Harriet Jacobs, you're getting a good sense that this is really rooted in the very beginnings of the colonies and then early U.S. history to define blackness and, the ways in which people are allowed to exist in these spaces. But there has always been, and McKittrick points this out, and always will be, contestation. Jacobs and her grandmother use whatever authority and reputation they can to carve out freedom, right? To protect themselves. Junior is using the lawsuit, just like those other farmers. So there are ways in which that, yes, the dominant way that power sees space tries to keep Blackness in a particular position on the hierarchy, but Black people are always fighting that. And I think the more we understand that and can support those efforts, the closer we're going to get to really redefining or deconstructing these power hierarchies themselves. So I'll end on that. This should give you enough to kind of get through the readings and understand the key concepts for this week. And then next week, we're going to start to really turn towards our main focus this semester, which is looking at geographic segregation and race.